I'm Vayoni Dimel. This is Boston Lanka News, so bringing you news, views and entertainment from Boston and USA. Rajiva Wijesinha is a scholar, political analyst and a writer. He headed the Peace Secretariat from 2007 to 2009 and became a member of the Parliament on the national list of the United People's Freedom Alliance. Professor Rajiva Wijesinghe joins with Boston Lanka. Professor Wijesinghe, now President Rajapaksa announced at the May Day rally that the elections to the Northern Provincial Council would be held in September. In a way, it's an acknowledgement that the 13th Amendment would stay. We also know that Jatika Helaurumeya and Vimal Veeravansa have begun to make noises against having the Northern Provincial elections. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think basically government must always stand by its commitments, and the President had made it clear repeatedly that he stood by the 13th Amendment, and indeed he talked in terms of 13 plus. Now, there is a case for saying that some aspects of the 13th Amendment might make people frightened about possible separatism. I think this was a very real fear when you had the Northeast merger, because the Northeast merger, as it was, set up an arbitrary unit that could see itself as separate from the rest of the island. But I think once the merger was abolished, and the merger should never have in fact happened in the first place, I think that fear went. Now there are some elements in the provincial councils, as I said, that could cause security concerns, but those are easily got over by amending, if necessary, some provisions while taking into account the fears of all communities. You can't satisfy the demands or the desires of everybody, but you can try to assuage the fears. So I think the fear of separatism is something that we need to assuage and make sure it cannot happen. But equally, you need to assuage the fears of the Tamil community that there will be majoritarianism, they will not be allowed to function in their language, their lands might be taken over. All those need to be assuaged. I think the Provincial Council is the best unit for that, but at the same time, we should be moving to greater empowerment of the people, and this is something that the President has put in his Chintanaya, of empowering grassroots as well by giving much more decision-making powers on the things that affect the day-to-day lives of people to local government institutions. I'm very glad that the President has made it very clear that he's not going to abandon commitments he's made, because it was because of that the animosity is developed so many times over the last 40 years.
Now let's move on to Sri Lankan foreign policy. You have been a strong critic of Professor G.L. Pires. In fact, there was a media report about you asking Dr. Jaila Jayawardena to move a motion to replace Professor Pires and appoint Dr. Dayan Dayathiraka as the foreign minister. What's wrong with Sri Lankan foreign policy? Why you want Professor Pires to be replaced?
Well, I should say that first I was teasing Jalak more than anything because they keep doing silly things and I think they should be more constructive. For instance, today they moved a vote of no confidence in one of the best ministers in the government. A very stupid thing to do, Dylan Pereira, who works very hard. The foreign ministry really has no policy. That's the problem. For instance, they sack people at the drop of a hat. Tamara Kuranaga, who was fulfilling what I would call traditional SLFP foreign policy, which is what the president stands for, which is non-alignment, where we are positive about everybody but negative about nobody, was completely reduced. And after we lost the vote in Geneva because of completely bad handling of all agencies, Tamara was sacked. And then some people in the foreign ministry began, as I put it, to dance on the graves of Diana and Tamara, saying it's all their fault for alienating the West. The problem is the West has its own agendas. And we all know that. That doesn't mean that we should reject everything the West says, because I think things like human rights are important for our people. But allegations of things like war crimes are complete nonsense, and we should deal with those firmly. We, on the one hand, keep saying, the foreign minister people do this in particular, rushing to say we must, assuage the West. And this is now the latest line that people are saying, why don't we encourage the West to treat us as a possible defense hub. Now that's absurd because we have to recognize that China, which did a lot for us, cannot be rejected. I'm certainly against the alternative to what I would call the mad foreign ministry idea of going totally with the West. The opposite is to go totally with China, which is equally nonsense. And I must say the Chinese have always made it clear to us, this came up very much in our discussion today when we're discussing foreign policy and Sri Lankan approaches to India, China and the West. China has always made it very clear to us that they don't expect an exclusive relationship. They understand the importance of India. And it is completely mad of people in Sri Lanka to think that China would want us to quarrel with India on their behalf. Unfortunately, there are people in the foreign ministry who still hanker after what I call the Jawas and the mistakes of the 80s, when they fought with India on the assumption that America would back them. And there may have been elements in America which supported them, and America let them down like a hot potato. So what I think should happen is that we should think things out carefully. We should discuss things in think tanks and achieve a policy that is consistent. We should also brief the president properly. Dan Jalika was telling us today about an incident that happened in 2011 when Karan Singh, who is a special envoy of the Indian government, had given Minister of Education certain suggestions on how Sri Lanka could help India to help us. And what happened? The report was sent to the president saying that Dayan had taken the side of India against Sri Lanka, and the message was never given. We believe that sometimes some messages the Indians have given us are not conveyed by the foreign minister to the president. So, we were told a year and a half ago that everything was very fine with India, which was nonsense. Earlier this year, when Bob Blake had come on a very tough visit, I was told that the Americans are very happy with Sri Lanka. It was clear that he was not happy. Now, we need to be serious and not try to just always say things that will please other people.
In a recent impeachment motion against C.J. Shirani Bandaranayake, you took a stand different from the government, and in fact, you thought the process was flawed. Could you explain?
Well, very simply, I think justice must not only be done but be seen to be done. And this is said in the Select Committee report. And justice will not seem to be done as far as the impeachment went. You see, as I have pointed out, there were several things wrong with the former Chief Justice. I had actually mentioned some of these in letters to the President because when I was trying to do the Human Rights Action Plan, I got no support from her. I was suggesting that the judiciary needs rules, the way some women are treated, especially under the vagrancy ordinance, inconsistent. And when I wrote, I just got no joy. She said, these are not my. And I said, the government must insist on controlling procedure in the courts. The independence of the judiciary means that their decisions must be independent. But they can't do what they like. And I used to keep recommending rules. But when she, as it were, was seen to do certain wrong things, and I have to say that on cope, I think her husband behaved at the best irresponsibly in his position. I think there should have been very clear investigations. Now, one of the points I made was that the standing order under which she was tried was a ridiculous standing order, and Ranil Wickremesinghe giggled and said, yes, what happened is we introduced half a standing order to control the former Chief Justice, and then we didn't introduce the other. Now, government should have realized that and made sure that there was a standing order under which her actions could have been investigated with high standards of proof. And I think there were terrible things like they didn't tell her they were going to call witnesses, and then they called them. And when I said to some of my colleagues, why did they do this? They said, oh, she was going to walk out anyway. I said, but you gave her a reason for walking out. So I think it was a ham-fisted exercise. I think it was unfortunate that it happened immediately after she gave a judgment on the Divinagama bill, which I think was a perfectly acceptable judgment. And later people in government said, no, it was okay, because she said, how do you amend it to make it passable? But the impression created, which I don't think was correct, was they want to get rid of her because of that. And I think you have to make sure that the position of Chief Justice is treated with respect, and she was not treated with respect. I think there are lots of things she did wrong that should have been properly investigated. A proper investigation would have actually, I think, encouraged her to resign. But the way they impeached her was wrong.
Professor, we know that you're not only a scholar, but also an accomplished writer. In your book, The Limits of Love, you have written about Richard de Souza, and you write, "It would seem Richard did not die in vain. Because of him, the reign of terror has ended." Now, Professor, given the way the media people are facing threats these days, you really think the terror has ended?
Well, I think you have to remember what many people have forgotten is some of the horrors Sri Lanka lived through. For instance, many people in Sri Lanka have forgotten what we lived through in terms of terrorism, all the way up to 2008. I was just discussing things like the central bank bomb. When I heard this, my sister came home covered in blood, but she was one of the lucky ones. So that type of horror happened, and we have to be grateful to the government for stopping it. Secondly, the death squads of the 1980s, you have to remember, were particularly horrendous. And although those stopped at that time, we still haven't had any even requests for accountability for what happened in those days. And that is what I call double standards. Now, I think, to me, what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years is that there have been certain abuses, and I've been the first to say that, it's disgraceful that things like the killing of Lasantha Wickrematunge have not been investigated. But I would prefer to adopt the approach of the civil rights movement, which didn't say this was done by government and we know that's why it's not investigated. I would suggest the approach should be, if the police are not able to follow up on things like that, there's something wrong with the police and we must acknowledge that. Now, I think, for instance, the latest lines, they talk about killings of journalists. But when I was head of the Peace Secretariat, I used to find things like killings of journalists, disappearances. The vast majority related to 2005-2006, which was a bad period because the LTT had been doing a lot of killing of Tamils who were not LTT. And when the balance changed, some of them started taking their revenge. Now, government's duty was to stop this, and by 2007 it had stopped. There's one very common story I tell is Human Rights Watch produced just before Geneva a magazine called, a glossy booklet called Disappearances in Sri Lanka. I think 97. But when I read through it, I said, hang on, 93 of these relate to 2006. There are only 3 in 2007. Now, 3 is 3 too many, but that is a big difference. And we brought things down. Now, once when I said this about journalists, 1 week later, Lasantha was killed. So that, almost negated everything I was saying, and we should look at that. But there is no such thing as media suppression in Sri Lanka. There is media intimidation. And I think that happens, but the media in Sri Lanka is very free. You compare the criticisms of the government, which are robust, with what happened in the 1980s. There was no free media at all. And one of the factors I always say is that all the people criticize Premadasa. Premadasa had 2 great virtues. I think he inherited a terrible situation and the first year was awful. But as I said, I think he realized it was getting out of hand. And with Richard's death, the message went out to the death squad, stop now. And I think that was Premadasa reigning in Rajiva Wijesinha. But Premadasa did 2 things afterwards. One, he never feared elections. Elections after Premadasa were free and fair, comparatively, as compared with the referendum or whatever. Secondly, he allowed the media to open up. People used to say it all happened under Wijesinha. That's nonsense. All the licenses were given in Premadasa's time. He was a genuine believer in diversity. Now, I think that is also true. One of our tragedies is I think Mahinda Rajapaksa has no fear of elections, and probably he'll win them. Unfortunately, he carries a lot of baggage, so that the parliamentarians insist on him having presidential elections early, so that he can carry them along with him. But I think he too recognizes that, like Premadasa, what he is doing is what the people want. What we have to do is try to adjust the policies to make them more accountable and make sure that the cabinet he has actually fulfills what he has suggested in his manifesto rather than going off on trips of their own.
Let me ask you one last question, Professor Wijesinha. You may not be interested in serving as the foreign minister, but if you were given an opportunity to be the Sri Lankan foreign minister, what would you do differently?
Well, God forbid that I should be offered the foreign ministry. It was very interesting when I was put into parliament. The Swiss ambassador said, "We hear that you're going to be the next foreign minister." And I thought that was a completely mad assumption because obviously there were more senior people and I thought much better people. Frankly, I now think I could do a better job than most people with the exception of Sarat Tamanukama, who I think would make a fantastic foreign minister, or Duke Gunasekara, whom everyone trusts. But I think I would do better than other people. But that's not what I would like. What I would like to do is reconciliation. But apparently, I was told that some aspects had been considered, but I had too many enemies. Chief of whom I have been told was Mr. Vimal Veeravansa, who has now attacked my educational activities. No, what I would do is first re-establish solid relationships with India, because that is clearly what all countries whom we think can make our allies have indicated needs to be our priority. Our relationship with India must be based obviously on Sri Lankan self-interest, but generally, India has always stood by us. And I think India doesn't need to have excessive concession. Of course, we must stand by our commitment, and the 13th Amendment and devolution is a commitment, but we have to also make it clear to India that we have serious security concerns, and some of those security concerns have been made more worrying by the activities of the diaspora that the West has supported. We have to make it very clear that we are an Asian country, and therefore we have very, very close links after India with the other countries in Asia. And then we have to also make it clear, though, that we have a very great commitment to the West, because that is what we need to develop our economy, our markets, and entrepreneurship. And in particular, we need, let us say, Western technical expertise in things like education, English, IT training, all of which are vital and which our Minister of Education is not giving, especially to the rural kids. It's all very well to say we have high educational standards, but when you don't have maths and science and English in rural areas, how can we talk about an egalitarian society? Then I would also set up think tanks. I think we need a professional foreign ministry. I think we need people who can think and produce position papers. Soon after I took over as reconciliation, I asked the Secretaries of Defense and of the Foreign Ministry to send me young people so we could set up a discussion group. Secretary of Defense promptly sent me 6 very bright young men who gave me ideas, 2 from the Army, 2 from the Navy, 2 from the Air Force, very bright, thinking all the time. Foreign Ministry said they were too busy. So this is the type of attitude we have. There is no interest in thinking. And I think that must change.
That concludes our news edition. We meet you again with another news edition of News, Views and Entertainment from Boston and USA. Till then, goodbye.